the training materials that I use when I conduct seminars for the community. So up until COVID, I was conducting annual seminars for local Bay Area business owners and IT professionals to really focus on kind of what the latest threats are and what they can do to protect themselves. So much of my material today is coming from that perspective. So if that is something that I know pretty much all of you are highly knowledgeable in the field. So I think you could look at this and take that part of it as ideas for materials that you could use if you're going to be conducting community informational sessions. Okay, so that's my my intro. I'm going to pull up there for a second since there's so few of us. If anybody wants to talk about any part of that, go ahead.
Yep, Mark, first, great introduction. Thank you. Just as you proceed, I'd like to hear more about the kind of the specific challenges of nation states, because if you will, to me, that's the gold standard of the hackers. So it's like if you can understand what they're doing and how to keep them out, get them out, and so on, and the challenges with that just helps all the way, down to dealing with amateurs, because you've got that appropriate mindset. So as you're going, as you can amplify that, I'd be grateful.
Absolutely, Stan. I will do that.
Hey, Mark, I just wanted to thank you for sufficiently dating all of us by rolling back to the 80s and 90s. I appreciate it.
Wait.
You're welcome.
I got to just jump in. I've tried to stay away from the discussion, John. But if you want to get dated, I started in this field in 1980 at MITRE. So, that's why there's no hair, all. Back in those days, I had hair.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take over control here for sharing. All right, so Stan, I'm going to get right to answering your request and talk about SolarWinds, what we know about SolarWinds. Can you all see this slide?
Sure can.
Okay. So the first part of the agenda that again, from the perspective of speaking to local, mostly small businesses like dentists' offices, accountants, that sort of thing, trying to educate them on the basics of what threats they're looking to combat, what the current attacks are that we're experiencing at the bank. And we see, because I have a very sophisticated infrastructure, which I will talk about, we see a lot of malicious traffic and have the opportunity to gain insight into what attackers are doing. One thing that maybe, if we have an opportunity to have a follow-up session at some later date, I publish a weekly report internally to the management of my organization, showing a lot of statistics and trends of some of the different cyber threats. For example, business email or basically CEO fraud, impersonation, where the geolocation of where malicious traffic is coming from against our DDoS firewall, the malware alerts that we get, so forth. And so for those of you who are running a cyber shop or who are building out that capability, I think you probably would be interested in seeing my weekly report just to get some ideas of how to report up to your senior executives and board to not only be transparent and to educate, but to help demonstrate the thing that is hardest, I think, for many of us practitioners to demonstrate, which is ROI, right? Because when we all do a good job, nothing happens. And that can lead to questions about why we're investing in this area. So, so by publishing weekly statistics that, again, remember I have an applied mathematics degree. So I've used that knowledge to present data in an informative way to try to convey meaning to other stakeholders who may not be technical. But we're not going to cover that today. So we will talk about from a banking, very specifically from a banking perspective, what some of the things that we're seeing are that may be of less interest to many of you. We'll kind of feel our way through that. And so that is the basic flow when I'm having these conversations with the community. Okay, so I'm going to, since there's so few of us, I'm going to pause for any comments there. Okay, hearing none, we'll proceed. So let's talk about SolarWinds. And since I'm here with so many luminaries and peers who are very, very experienced in the space, feel free to challenge me. I'm going to share not only information that I've collected about the SolarWinds situation, but countermeasures that I see that would be effective in preventing what actually happened. So like I said, feel free to challenge me. You may know more than I do about some of this. You know, look at this. Look at the SolarWinds breach through the perspective of a hacker. Okay, you're working for a government. You're a professional. Your task is to break into these organizations I've listed here. How are you gonna approach that? Well, first of all, we all know that you're not going to break through the firewall like in a movie, right? With somebody typing and somehow miraculously hacking through a firewall. No, you're gonna work from the inside. And of course, the tool of choice for I want to say almost all breaches is phishing, and phishing was the root cause of the breach that I experienced. They phished the CEO. They sent the CEO a resume that was too good to be true of a grad student in China who had amazing credentials and wanted to come work for the company. And so the CEO opened the PDF resume and got malware on his computer, and that's what led to the entire cascading breach. So yeah, phishing is the tool of choice, and I think will continue to be so. I think supply chain attacks like SolarWinds and the motherboard one that happened a couple years ago are more rare, and I think that over time we may see them become more prevalent, especially since companies like SolarWinds are soft targets. I think we probably have all read enough about what happened at SolarWinds to form the opinion that they probably didn't do enough to protect the code base, right? So I think, you know, I would expect to see over time, over the next 5 to 10 years, more escalation in supply chain attacks. Primarily, I think we're all going to continue to be combating phishing as the number one threat. That's my opinion. Okay, but in this case, so the adversary decided to attack SolarWinds in order to get into their targets. Okay, so as we know, they were extremely stealthy. They were able to get inside these organizations and exfiltrate information and move laterally without detection. And for some reason that I don't understand, let's go back, look at this list of victims. Clearly government institutions that probably had no clue, or I think we know they had no clue that they were breached, right? They also went after Microsoft and FireEye. And I don't understand why. That seems like a bad call, because FireEye, is much more capable of detecting a breach than the rest of those victims. So, of course, FireEye did discover the breach, although not right away. But they sounded the alarm, and basically when that happened, I believe from my knowledge of nation-state attacks that the adversary is going to abandon that and start over with something fresh. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about attribution. Who did it? But let me pause again for any comments on that. Okay, hearing none. Attribution. Well, you're all pretty sophisticated, so you probably already know who did it. But I think there was some obfuscation about that, at least for a while. Could have been Russia, could have been China. How do we know who is behind a nation-state breach? So, speaking from experience, I know China was behind the one that I experienced. The code that they use is recognizable and unique. We can look at their libraries, compilers, and so forth. Of course, the various platforms that they use for command and control. That's almost like signal intelligence, right? For those of you familiar with that term, looking at the communication patterns in order to understand who's behind it, okay. So here's where again, this is a subject of a lot of interest for me, nation-state attacks, based on my experience. So one thing that I think, first of all, we need to keep in mind, why are they doing this? Why did the attackers go after these particular organizations, mostly government organizations? And I think a lot of it's because it's politics. They have strategic goals that they're attempting to meet, and cyber operations is an important part of their overall political strategy. Now, if we look at the different regions that are highly active in this area, of course, Asia, very bureaucratic and very widespread in terms of their targets, right? They go after many targets and they hit them hard. Russia typically is much more technically advanced, second only to the U.S. really, and very evasive, very stealthy. Middle East, we see a lot of malicious traffic from the Middle East. They're primarily, they are using automated tools to send malicious packets to our network, but primarily they are behind phishing campaigns and social engineering. And then the U.S. We're the ones who started it all, right? And many of you probably know that, right? In the U.S., we decided to look into cyber operations as a means to facilitate military operations. Especially if you can disable an adversary's military defenses, it gives you an advantage. Of course, that opened Pandora's box, and all of these other countries followed suit. Okay, so China, as I said, doesn't typically have a very sophisticated malware, but like likening it to my experience at the previous company, they pretty much just go after potential victims, and they'll be happy to send a PDF attached malware payload to somebody, and they don't care if they get caught, and they don't care if it's attributed to them. Russia, however, by way of comparison, doesn't want to get caught and will not want to admit that they are involved in any kind of cyber operations, right? They go to extraordinary lengths to hide their objectives and their identities. They use false flag operations. And so the Middle East and the US also have their own unique approaches. So based on all of this, without knowing anything about the forensics of the SolarWinds situation, I think we can all sort of reasonably conclude, at least tentatively, that Russia hits the pattern of what happened, right? Especially due to the stealth. Okay, so I mean, I don't have concrete evidence to support that. I'm just sharing with you how we can look at this from the perspective of cyber operations and who we might expect it to be attributed to. All right, pause here for questions and comments. I'm sure somebody would challenge that.
Well, I have a question. This is Charlie Schwab. I'll go back a little bit. One technical part, I don't know too much of the detail around this. I've read some things. My question was, I get how they could break into the supply chain, you know, the software piece, and load some code on there. What I didn't understand is how they achieved the privileged access capability required to do some of the things that were going on.
I can answer that, actually.
Great.
So the first step is gaining a foothold, right, on a given computer. And from there are numerous techniques that they can use to compromise other nearby computers. And so at the bank, we hire the most sophisticated penetration testers we can find to test our internal network. And it's amazing what they're capable of. For example, on Microsoft Windows, there is a component called LSAS. You may have heard of or be familiar. It's a networking service that stores passwords within it in plain text. I want to say plain text. Actually, one of you might correct me. It could be a simple hash. In any case, there's a tool called Meatycats. The pen test. Yeah. And so Meatycats can get the passwords. And during our penetration test, they were easily able to, just within minutes, get 2 sysadmin, domain admin account passwords from our network using Meatycats just from connecting remotely over RPC to these other computers. So that's one way, right? You get yourself a privileged password, privileged credentials. We're very careful with our credentials, right? We don't have sysadmins or domain admins that read email or surf the web. They have a separate dedicated account for doing system administration tasks. It's closely monitored, and it's not exposed to the normal threats that a regular user account is exposed to. And yet the pen testers were easily able to get those passwords without setting off, I'll say without setting off any alarms. I'm going to talk about the kill chain a little bit, so we can understand where we might detect such activity. But that's just one example. We've seen lateral movement in other areas, and the other thing that our pen tests have shown us is that very often information on the network is wide open, even though we're careful about it and we protect the information that we know about. Sometimes people will, or software applications will drop confidential information on a network share that is wide open. And so we've had numerous pen tests come out and surprise us, thinking that our permissions were locked down and finding open shares containing confidential customer information. So once they get a foothold, they have a lot of options of how to move around and try to get at their objective. So Charles, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kill chain, where I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that. But how does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I'm familiar with the topics you're talking about, having done a lot of folks doing pen testing in my world. People get in all over the place, until you close it back down. I'm just kind of curious how they did, but once they piggybacked into the software, they had to get those accounts understood so they could then do the other things they wanted to do. And so it's just kind of interesting. And then it's shipped out to everybody who uses the software, so they can call home again. I just didn't. Their exact, exact process for executing that was just kind of a little gray to me. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm going to get into more detail on that here when I get into the kill chain. So first, some of the stuff I'm talking about, you might be familiar with these two. There's a book here that I'm recommending and a movie that I'm recommending for all of us. Very entertaining, very informative. And this is not, I don't have any personal interest in these. This is just a recommendation of something I've seen that I found very illuminating. Dark Territory is a book really talks about what I just said earlier, which is how the U.S. Started cyber operations as a military adjunct, and how it escalated from there, and how the other countries saw what we were doing and picked up on it. And of course, the Stuxnet situation is in there, and it's also in this movie called 0 Days, which is basically a documentary. It's a little bit dramatized, but they do interview some really interesting hackers that work for the U.S. government, and they talk about some of their tricks, like how to jump an air gap. I think Charles's question is a good one. How do they move around on the network? But it's even more amazing to me the techniques that they can use to move around off the network onto a separate isolated network. Very, very good movie. Maybe you've seen it or heard of it. Anyway, that's a recommendation for you. Okay, so let's get into the kill chain. Getting back to Charles's question, when we look at a breach, including a nation-state breach, it pretty much needs to go through all 7 stages of the kill chain. And the kill chain, I'm sure you're all familiar with the model for moving from an idea of a breach to the actual completion of a breach through these 7 stages, which I understand were adapted from other military models and strategies. So stage 1 is the reconnaissance stage. In the case of SolarWinds, I think what the attackers did was look at what organizations they wanted to get into, what infrastructure components like SolarWinds they were using, and probably narrowed down to a short list of candidates of who they could attack within that supply chain, and then probably did some analysis of each of those potential candidates to determine how strong their defenses were, and SolarWinds must have looked like a ideal target for that. So weaponizing with the malware, normally we see this with phishing, right? We see that a malware payload is embedded into some kind of a document typically, or maybe it's a simple link, which is a little less sophisticated. In this case, of course, much more sophisticated, they got into the code base and inserted their own code into SolarWinds code base, and in such a way that SolarWinds signed the code. I see multiple failures there, right? Failures on behalf of SolarWinds to protect their code base. And my own experience in Silicon Valley, working for lots of high-tech companies, is that, they're focused on features and they're focused on delivery. they're not at all typically focused on securing their code. I've worked for other software companies who typically don't even have the basics of code security in the code itself, such as checking bounds and validating inputs, much less a robust code signing and code control capability. So Russia, the attacker was able to deliver their malware into that source code at the delivery stage. Okay, and at this point we're on the third stage of what happened.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Just as you're talking about the weaponization and everything, I'm going to paste up here on the chat window. It's an unbelievably, in-depth discussion from CrowdStrike about exactly how the weaponization is done in the software. So if you guys are into that stuff, it's good reading.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to look at that. So they delivered the malware to SolarWinds and let SolarWinds deliver the malware to everybody else that uses SolarWinds. Now, we know that they were interested in attacking those specific targets, and the rest of us are collateral damage, right? So at the exploitation stage, I think in this context, you could look at the SolarWinds malware being triggered, phoning home to its domain for instructions and providing control. That's one of the areas where I'm going to talk about defensive strategies, where I think that that those organizations probably could have done more to prevent that stage of the attack. But anyway, so the victims then had the malware phoning home, and the malware, presumably, I don't know what this particular malware did, but typically now, was that a comment? I didn't catch that. Malware will typically spread itself and pull down lots of other malware components, right? The first one is just a hook, and it'll pull down lots of stuff that attackers can then use more conveniently to move around. And so full remote access is often the goal, where the attacker can then use that compromised computer to either gain access to what the user has access to, or run some more exploits on other systems, maybe to get access to a server or some other device. So that's command and control. And finally, action on objective, when they exfiltrate what their trophy is. Okay, so you're probably already familiar with what I just said. Let's talk about what I've done. This is what I've done in my organization based on what I've learned experiencing a breach, a nation-state breach. Much of what I've put on this list is really intended to slow down, at least, or preferably interrupt each stage of the kill chain. And the ones I put in red font here, I think, are particularly unique to SolarWinds. So I think we should focus on those. I think that, if you want, we could talk about a lot of these other things. This is basically a dashboard view into my entire security infrastructure and operations at my organization. I think that's probably more interesting to most of you than some of the other stuff I have. So if you want to ask questions about this, feel free. Let me start with SolarWinds context. So in terms of weaponization, right? Exploits are developed for exploiting vulnerabilities in software. And if you keep your software up to date, you close those CVEs, you reduce the attack surface, you force the attacker to use 0 days rather than older vulnerabilities, which still leaves a lot of attack surface. But in the case of SolarWinds, it was ironic that best practice of keeping software up to date was the actual vector. And so that, in my opinion, does not alleviate the value of software updates. It's still, all of our networks are chock full of vulnerabilities, any one of which could be exploited. Our goal should be to reduce those. But we'll have to see what happens, what comes next. Is this a one-off? Are we going to see more supply chain attacks that these compromised software updates? I recall the one with, remember CCleaner? CCleaner, the cool little system Windows cleanup tool that the supply chain attackers hacked the delivery servers, right? Software download servers. So you go to download your CCleaner, and the malware is injected into it as it's downloading. But so far, those have been fairly few and far between, and updating, I think, is still a good best practice. What else are we going to do, right? So, next up in the delivery phase, minimizing use of administrative privileges. That's something that I mentioned we do in our organization. We certainly don't want anybody with privileged access to the opening email, clicking on links, any of the things that people normally do to provide that administrator access directly to an adversary. So we very strictly control what those privileged accounts are supposed to be doing. Now, in stage 4, this is where I think the most important countermeasures are. Behavior-based malware detection, for starters. We have Cylance on our computers, and I don't know if any of you are running Cylance. I did a bake-off between Cylance and Bit9 and some of the other competitors. I like Cylance. It's the one I chose. It has some pretty cool capabilities, like, for example, blocking PowerShell scripts, which we are doing. PowerShell is a very powerful tool in the hands of an attacker, and it's built into Windows. And so not a lot you can do about it, but Cylance, we have Cylance set up to prevent the execution of any PowerShell script on every Windows computer that it's installed on. It's agent-based, so it's in the end-user space for us. And, of course, we have legitimate PowerShell scripts like everybody does, and we've whitelisted those so we know exactly, what we have and what's allowed to run. So I think that one's really important. Application whitelisting kind of goes hand in hand. That's very, very difficult to do in a Windows environment, but it is something you can do when I worked at the previous company, I was in the process of implementing application whitelisting on factory machines that are PCs are running this machine that builds stuff, and so locking that in with basically solid core at the time was what I used. We actually run that on our ATMs at the bank as well. So IP address blacklisting. Here's something that I do that I recommend to everybody. On a daily basis, I have my team looking at the firewall logs and what our outermost firewall is a denial of service firewall upstream of our ISP router, which we have benefited from on many occasions because we have experienced denial of service attacks, probably about 6 to 8 of those on a significant scale since I've been with the bank. But when it's not a denial of service attack, it's just malicious traffic as recognized by the firewall. I have my team every single day making a list of all those IP addresses, sending that unwanted traffic to us, and putting them into a blacklist. So I have a massive blacklist of IP addresses. And the thinking there, the rationale is that if they're being malicious, I don't want my firewall to have to work hard, right? I know they're malicious. I don't want to see or hear from them. So it's like being banned from Facebook, right? I don't have to moderate their content. I can just ban them. That's just an analogy. So, of course, callback detection is extremely important. We have FireEye. When I look at those organizations that were compromised, I wonder if they had any of these capabilities. I would have expected an unusual callback to a command and control server to be detected. And, you know, y'all, I'm sure remember the Target breach from back in 2015. They had FireEye. And FireEye was throwing alerts all day long, and they turned it off because it was annoying them, right? They didn't, the IT guys didn't believe that they were real alerts. And I have to contend with that every day. All these things that I have, many IT professionals that I work with simply don't believe in the validity of these alerts. Why? I don't know. Maybe because they haven't been breached. But it's, you know, that's a big hurdle to overcome when you're working in a shop where you want to have robust incident response, and there's kind of a culture of disbelief in the organization. And so let me pause. I'm halfway through, but and I'm going to go on to network behavior control next. But any comments?
Yeah, a question on your IP address blacklisting. Are you using any data feeds, indicators of compromise from Homeland Security or other kinds of places to help you with that? Or you have sticks enabled and so on to automate that process?
Yeah, great question, Stan. We only do that. We don't have it like an automatic feed, and I'm a little uncomfortable with an automatic feed. But we do manually enter when there's a memo that comes out with indicators of, certainly in the SolarWinds announcement, we did manually block the domain and the IP address ranges. You know, we are not, and I think it's a good practice. And there's a lot of talk. You know, I'm very active in FSISAC, and there's a lot of good threat intel there, and a lot of good IOCs that come from that organization. But honest answer, I have not subscribed to an automated IOC blocking capability. I would worry a little bit, right? I would worry a little bit about something, you know, getting in there that shouldn't be in there, and that shuts down an important service. But anyway, that's the answer.
Okay.
I have a quick question, just, you know, on the minimizing the use of administrative privileges. One of the things that really irks me, it's less now, I think, you know, admins are getting more used to accountability and whatnot, but the default, you know, approach, especially for smaller shops, is just, you know, the admin accounts have access to everything. Usually it's, you know, the administrative group, right? Administrative group. And you go to every single folder on the network, all the HR stuff, all the, you know, important strategic stuff, you know, and gee, there's administrator with full privileges, full control. I'm sure you guys don't permit that, but I just wanted to say that's a really bad practice.
It is, absolutely. I mean, to Charles's point earlier, you know, question of how an attacker can move around freely within a network. Certainly, if you hand them the keys to the kingdom, right, there's no constraints.
Well, one thing, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, it's not my feedback. I've seen recently, I won't say the name of the company, but I was doing a due diligence of a PEO company, which has a lot of confidential information, obviously. And they had created a small company, and it was a completely open, no trust, open trust. There was no trust at all. And I don't know, are you starting to deploy more rigid network segmentation and trust controls. So even if you do get to one area, so at least you can slow them down trying to get to another area.
Yeah, segmentation is important. On my network, our network doesn't have a whole lot of segmentation internally, and I have seen very few organizations that do. You know, we're all hearing and talking to these micro segmentation vendors that do like profiling and learning of what systems are communicating on the network and then locking that in. That's something we're kind of evaluating. But as of today, the way our network looks, I'm not saying it's ideal, but just, you know, in terms of what I actually have, the internal network is pretty flat. Workstations can get to, right, and workstations can get to admin interfaces, which is not a best practice, administrative interfaces. But we do have a well-defined perimeter around that flat network, and that's important. And then any partner networks, and we have about a little more than a dozen partner networks, VPNs, because we're a financial services company. There's lots of other financial services providers that do processing for us. Those all come in on VPNs into our DMZ, and that's one of my rules is you don't bring a VPN into your core network. You bring it into your DMZ and control the traffic that's going through. It's untrusted. A VPN to me is untrusted. So that's one of my tenets. And what is that agreement I hear? Yeah, I don't trust any third parties. John, did you unmute there?
Yeah. Hey, Mark. So this is great stuff. You know, I'd also just like to add, just for a SecOps unit, like we're primarily SecOps teams, and so the one thing I think that if you can, in reconstructing the kill chain, which of course helps SecOps teams, is the optics that the customers have put in the environment. So we unfortunately today have I would say, which is weapons saturation in terms of vendors, backed by PE and venture capital that are trying to sell their products so they can raise their next round, and customers think that they buy one of these things, it's going to help them, which it may. I mean, we're a silence shop, as you're a silence shop. We recommend silence to our customers as well. But what I would say is, for all of these places, the thing that really helps customers and what helps SecOps and response units like us when we get in there is when they have good intelligence and good optics in the environment. Because it doesn't mean it's game over once the bad guys got you. If you've got good optics, non-repudiated intelligence logging in the environment, that's huge. And it drives down the cost of response. And it also helps us in containment eradication and response, because we can see the bad guy through the kill chain, where they're going to move next, what they're going to do, that kind of stuff. So I kind of think of like the kill chain always. I'm a big kill chain guy. I always think about the kill chain. If you were to just draw a vertical bar on the right of this slide that just said log, attribution is king. Like if we could figure out what happened quickly, then the quicker we're going to be able to contain it. So just to throw my 2 cents in on that.
Yeah, that's great. John, do you have a technology you use for that for optics, for that visibility, or is that a collection like I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
Different tools?
Yeah, it's just all collection for the different tools. So anything that you get, like we love to see post logging. Our model is typically to get the customers to, a lot of customers, everybody on the call knows this, especially the larger guys. It's going to be something like, a Splunk or a Sumo or something like that. We're a Sumo partner. But quite frankly, what we like to see the customers do is install some central syslog. We're old school guys. And then downstream those to the various consumer tools like a Splunk or, a SIM tool, whatever you've got in there. But just getting centralized syslog in the environment that's in a non-repudiated fashion, where it's being dumped out to raw disk, is huge, especially for, hardcore guys. After we've located that, the blue boat in the middle of the ocean, using one of the indexer tools, then we can get down on target and actually look at this stuff. Plus, I think it offers other opportunities. So yeah, the answer there, quite frankly, is just syslog where you can. The other thing is that in the cloud, you know, our companies are in the cloud. We've got exceptionally good logging in those environments, which really helps us more when we're fighting the bad guys. But for the typical bank flat networks, or not flat networks and banks, but the typical bank networks are a little bit older school sometimes in what they have, especially the credit unions and, you know, some of the mom and pop credit unions and stuff that we see. The first thing we like to do is have them just drop in central syslog. If you go to our GitHub, we've got Docker containers for that, and just, you know, stuff that folks can put in place. And then once you get that there, then you can downstream it to the various tools. But every one of these tools that you've listed here, by the way, I love seeing the Vectra. I'm not necessarily a Vectra endorser or non-endorser, but network detection is huge. DNS is your friend. Like, we're big bro guys, or what do they call it now, Zeke. You know, we like to see companies put that kind of stuff in.
Yeah, great.
Can I just say really quick that you guys are bringing up so many really good things here. And you made the point, John, about how especially smaller banks and maybe credit unions, they're really in over their heads in many ways. And one of our biggest challenges with this group here is how we can get this kind of discussion to the right people in banks so that they can understand what their admin is not doing and what they need to do. And we have trouble getting to those guys. So I'm just saying, whatever you guys can do to bring, and Stan's going to talk about this, we want to try to up our game and see how we can reach out to some of those people. They're probably C-level, they may be in the boardroom, but they just don't have enough technical grounding to hold their information security organization accountable to good practices. So I'm just going to plant that seed.
Yeah, I concur with it. And I'd also say, John, you know, I'm not a big fan of regulation, unless of course it benefits me. But that's really the way home for this stuff. You know, some of the guys on the phone were talking about PCI DSS. A lot of us remember when it first came out, you know, this is a pain in the ass. I don't think there's one person on the phone now that would say how beneficial that was for across the industries. And never mind all the other regulations that we have. We deal a lot with 800-171. We're an 800-171 customer. I think regulation is part of what we need here. We need people to, you know, get involved with, whether it's, you know, the credit union, the NCUA stuff, where they basically say you are forced to do this. It's not just waiting for it, because a lot of the mom and pops don't understand the risk, and they don't understand it until they're popped.
Yeah.
So anyway, that would be my, you know, if we could get more regulation or, you know, influence to get them to move.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, John. You know, working for a bank, out of my entire career, I've worked for a bank maybe 25% of my career, and the rest is in other industries. And it's certainly by far easier to do what we do in a highly regulated environment, especially when the regulators are going way beyond the written rules, right? Way beyond. They're looking for best-in-class programs in business continuity and you know, cyber threat prevention, and customer data exfiltration. If it wasn't for the regulations, you know, I mean, my experience in other companies is that it's very, very hard to get funding. I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate in a couple of ways. First, when I joined the bank, they had a failing security operation, and they tasked me with tearing it down and you know, doing a complete ground up rebuild. Which is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for any of us that, you know, has that. And I was able to define my organization the way I wanted to. I have a team of 3 analysts and a team of 3 engineers and a team of 2 management that run my daily operations. And that's kind of out of a 1,000 employee company. That's pretty good, at least in my experience. That's one of the larger organizations, security organizations I've seen in a company my size, and it wouldn't be possible without the regs. And I'm no fan of regulations, but I certainly have to admit that it's effective in what we do, and it should be effective in other areas like government, like many of the fintechs. You know, fintechs are one of our pet peeves, because they're not regulated, right? And so we have to do all this stuff. We have to spend all this money. And the fintechs like, you know, Rocket Mortgage, those guys do whatever they want. So yeah, I completely agree. Regulation is needed. I think, you know, but you got to get somebody who understands that up into the levels of government where they can actually influence that. So great point. I also, okay, so I want to emphasize one other thing that's important in my shop, which is incident response. Based on my experience with the breach that I experienced, I decided that incident response, and I've come to believe that incident response is the single most important thing that you can have in place to prevent a breach. Single most important. Why? Because all of these tools that we have antivirus. I have three different antivirus tools. Malware still slips through. You know, we have a lot of detective tools, capabilities, but they're not going to stop an attack. Not always going to stop an attack, right? It has to be manual intervention, and that manual intervention needs to be fast and effective. So, I have a 5-minute SLA. I run my team 24/7. As I said, I have 8 people with the capability of doing incident response. They're highly trained. I put one of them on call for a week, and they respond to any alert within 5 minutes. I don't care if it's 3 a.m., right? Speed is of the essence, right, in interrupting the kill chain. If a malware, if we get a malware alert, I don't do a whole lot of forensic investigation, right? I don't really care how deep the malware got in, or whether it was blocked by McAfee, or whether it was stopped, you know, when somebody clicked on a phishing link and it was blocked by Blue Coat. I don't care. I nuke their system. That whatever that target system was, a PC, it's gone, right? If it's a physical PC, we destroy the hard drive. Most of our users, about 800 of our users, are on VDI, which makes it a lot easier. Just reset their session back to a known good state. But I don't mess around with malware. You know, any malware, suspected malware, I'm not going to trust that system ever again. And it needs to be terminated within 5 minutes, or preferably less. That's how I run my shop. So incident response, I go around saying this. A lot of people, you know, when I go through examinations and audits and stuff, oh, how's your vulnerability management, right? How many vulnerabilities do you have? Well, you know, from my point of view, vulnerability management is the best practice. And I've said that, you know, it's important to reduce the attack space, but it's not the most important thing, right? It's not the highest thing we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on what are our capabilities, have that visibility, John, that you were talking about, and what do we do about it, right? When we see something unusual, anomalous, potentially risky, what do we do? And we make sure that that response is definitive and effective. So that's why I could sit back here and I could talk about the stages of the kill chain. I could talk about SolarWinds and how I tell my board of directors, I think we are very well positioned to avoid being a victim of this kind of attack, even a nation state attack. Because of the visibility we have, because of the strong incident response we have, and I didn't get to the later stages where, you know, the attacker has somehow managed to slip through all the previous stages and now has control of your network. The traffic that's coming from your network to going out to somewhere on the internet, I inspect that very closely. So Palo Alto is a great tool for looking at network communication, especially from applications on PCs. DLP, I can't imagine, honestly, I don't know the details of how these government organizations experienced exfiltration. What was their DLP doing, right? I mean, if you're that far along the kill chain and data is flowing out of your network, how do you not see that, right? That's a fundamental. And I emphasize encryption as well. You know, I talked to Bruce Schneier. You guys know who Bruce Schneier is. I talked to him quite a long time ago. I want to say it was the late 90s. And at the time, he was very focused on encryption, emphasizing encryption, saying that, you should encrypt everything, and then it doesn't matter who steals it, right? Because it's useless. I disagreed with him that encryption should be really the sole protection for data, but I do agree that it's very, very important. And so, so where we can, when we have customer data on our network, we encrypt it, and at rest. This is a conversation that can be challenging with third parties, because when you want to share data with third parties, right, which we do a lot, being bank, I want it encrypted at rest as well as in transit. And most of these, or at least many of these third parties, they'll say, oh, we have TLS 1.2, so don't worry, it's encrypted. I'm like, no, I want to encrypt the file itself before I give it to you. And I want you to decrypt it when you receive it, right? Load it into your system and destroy it. Because I'm worried about that data being lifted from wherever it happens to be sitting, right? I'm not as concerned about the transfer, but I have this conversation all the time, and usually have to convince or demand our third parties accept a PGP encrypted file. Because, and I've walked through dozens of other companies on how to use PGP, because they've never done it before and nobody has ever asked for it before. And I get that a lot because, I think a very important part, I know John M. will agree that a very important part of being prepared for cyber operations is believing in them, right? Understanding that there are real risks, real tangible concrete risks. And so these actions that we take are intended to make it much more difficult for those real world adversaries to get access to our data. So going back to the government agencies, were they encrypting their data? Probably not, right? Did they have the ability to detect, to see the optics of when data is leaving their network? Probably not. They probably should have. That's the sort of thing that I would advocate for being regulations. I would love to see the regulations that we have in the banking world expanded to include a mandate for encrypting data at rest, which I have not seen. And I don't mean internally, right? Internally, yes, but I mean before transferring to a third party. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to pull up there. I think that's raised some good discussion. We can talk more about this. I feel like at this point I want to pause the rest of the material because what we're going to move on. What we would move on to next is the sort of the basics for mom and pop kind of shops that don't really know much about cyber, and so trying to raise that level of belief of believing in the tangible threats that are out there through explaining what we're seeing and what they can do, what smaller organizations can do. So very, very different sort of a tone in the rest of my materials today. I don't think it's going to be that much of interest unless you really want to see what I'm sharing with the community. But I think we could cover that another time. And I do feel like, the next topic that I would be interested in talking about, if I were to return, would be the weekly report that I have, kind of share that with you guys. Maybe hear your opinions if you have ideas on other things we can share internally. But maybe some of that would be helpful for you as well to see what I'm sharing. I've given a lot of thought to KPIs, right? I worked for a couple organizations that were very, very focused on organizational efficiency and effectiveness and use KPIs for everything. And, so I've struggled with taking all of this information that we have here and the information flows that come out of it and turn it into not a metric, right, metrics are important, and I use metrics to manage, but KPIs to really convey to non-technical executives how effective we're being, right, at what we do. So I think that would be probably a more interesting conversation for you guys than the rest of this. And I'm going to need to pull up anyway to go back to my day job pretty soon. So, John C., you want to do we want to open it up for more kind of open discussion at this point?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. I see we have people, I think they had 10 o'clock commitments, so it may be that we don't have a lot of time. If there's a burning desire, does anybody want to jump in before we get to, I want Stan to have a few minutes before we drop.
Well, I'm wondering, and don't mind the phone in the background, I just went off mute.
Normal.
The phone was ringing. I'd love to get you back. Next month, we've got a speaker already, but maybe get you back in a couple of months, kind of to take to the next piece of this, because that's a segue into what is effectively, if you will, financial services cybersecurity roundtable 2.0. As John said, as we raised the game, we've just recently updated our website. We're now positioned as an international organization, not a Los Angeles-based organization. And what we want to do with this group, like we're doing with other groups as well, we have several of them, is get them much more interactive, grow the numbers of attendees. We've had a total of 12 today. There's still 10 of us on here. We should have 50 people at a meeting. And certainly, Mark, what you're talking about, finishing up, if you will, relates to that. So some of the things we want to do, first of all, have at these meetings more interactive time to talk about, okay, what might we do together so as to raise the cybersecurity game in the community, particularly in this organization's case, focused around financial cybersecurity, but not just for banks. I mean, we just had a client $500,000 went out the door in a business email compromise case. Oh. I mean, it's like, wow. Oh God, how did that happen? But you look at it, and it was a piece of the business that they'd never asked us to look at, and it was uncontrolled change of vendors. Nobody was managing that process. Nobody picked up the phone and said, "Hey, is this a legitimate change of vendor? You know, vendor bank accounts." Kind of thing. So a lot of what we do is we got to reach out beyond just the people in the cybersecurity space. One of the ways we'll do that, as I say, at these kinds of meetings, have much more discussion. Another thing, and expect this in the next, probably take us 4 or 5 days till we get this, put together for this group. But one of the things I learned in a business networking group I was in for probably 15 years, a group called Provisors, if some of you know it, is the idea of getting together outside of these meetings in what Provisors call troikas, goes back to the Russian word for, 3 leaders. And we'll send out an email breaking this group up into groups of 3 or 4 people. Please get together in between this meeting and the next meeting and begin talking about these things, get to know each other, build community, because that's a key piece of how we're going to move forward that way. There is so much work to do, and we see Secure the Village as, being well positioned to help manage this, because we're not just technical people, we're not just financial people, we're attorneys and cyber insurance brokers, IT people. We want to bring in more regulators into this group and so on, so that we truly, the idea takes a village to secure the village. So stay tuned for all of that. Mark, this was absolutely fabulous. This was and kudos, John, because you found Mark. So it goes there as well. But would definitely love to have you back in a couple of months and continue this, and maybe if you're up for it, have you talk at some of our other working groups as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stan. I'm happy to. It's very important for me to help the entire community and help the entire world be safer. Not just because I think that it's a great way to spend a life, but because we're all better prepared to defend against the adversaries that we face if we work together. You know, this one of the things I like about this field of cybersecurity is that there's no mindset of we don't want the other guys to know what we do because it's our edge in business, right? On the contrary, we want everybody to know what we do because we all want to improve on each other, and we're all very open to improvement. So yeah, I'm more than happy to keep participating. I do have some materials if you do manage to get some more participation from small businesses and that sort of thing. The rest of what I have in the deck here is really tailored to them, and they weren't here today. But if we wanted to if you do manage to gather that kind of an audience, I have some good things to share. But I also have a lot of other materials I could share with this type of audience as well.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things we've done, we have a new website just came out. So it's part of SecureTheVillage 2.0. And we're building a library that's easily searchable and so on. So we'd be happy to post links to your information if you send them to us and all. Also, we've created categories of what we're calling cyber leaders and cyber partners, cyber leaders being people in this space. And you can register on the website. I'd encourage all of you to do that. Your companies as cyber partners, if your companies play in the cybersecurity space, or like Fremont Bank, all the banks are there. And with that, if you're doing other events, we're happy to post them. We see our website kind of as the village square for it takes a village to secure the village that way. And if our role is helping to connect the dots here, introducing Mark to Charles, to Michael, to John, to Mark, and so on, because it's out of that more good things will happen. And that's our whole, what it is that Secure the Village is about. So,
great.
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. I'm going to just jump in really quick and give you guys a tease for next month. We've got Susan Waba, who today she is the BSA officer, senior vice president at Pacific City Bank. In about 2 weeks, she will no longer be at that organization, and she's going to a bank startup that is going to be really exciting. They bought a small bank, and they have plans to grow very quickly. And I know most of the people over there, so it should be interesting. Anyway, Susan will be with us. She's going to talk. So her domain is a lot about things like anti-money laundering controls. She's also been a chief risk officer, which is typically, the point at which information security may interface, specifically the CISO or ISO may interface with the rest of the bank.
Remember to move my my veggie plants away from the basketball court.
So
I'm gonna be playing hooping out there.
Maybe we can. Okay. So anyway, she'll be here to talk about BSA, but it also has a crossover with information security and how, she sort of works with the overall risk and information security function. So that's next month. Thanks, everybody. That's it. That's all I have, Stan.